Mohammed El-Kurd, Palestinian poet, writer, author of the new book, Perfect Victims. Mohammed, thank you so much for joining me on the Empire Files. It's such a huge honor to have you.
Thank you. It's my honor. Thank you for having me.
Mohammed, I loved your book. I flew through it. I feel like it really articulates and clarifies so much about the propaganda that not only deeply dehumanizes the Palestinian, but also keeps people trapped in these endless rhetorical loops and bad faith arguments. Like you said, side arguments to the burning flesh right in front of us. So I guess just start by telling us who are the perfect victims.
Well, a perfect victim is someone who adheres strictly to a predetermined, civility, usually predetermined by Western ethnocentric standards that demands a certain, being docile, demands submissiveness, it demands concession after concession, it demands surrendering the future and surrendering your national ambitions and collective anti-colonial ambitions and just any kind of political ambitions, turning the other cheek. And in other words, this is a mythical feature. This feature does not. This figure does not exist.
Right. I mean, it made me critical of my own framing, particularly the quote unquote just worthy victims. I mean, if someone's murdered who's not wearing a press jacket or a medic coat, it doesn't make them any less worthy. And obviously, the disproportionate assault on women and children have made this kind of framework an inevitability, I guess, and a desperate appeal to some sort of morality out there. But it takes away from the mass murder of Palestinian men and the unending tragedy of that. And that really underpins the entire genocidal onslaught as a justification.
Absolutely. Not only does it take away from the value of the lives of millions and millions of Palestinian men, but it also robs women of their agency. This kind of framing of women and children positions women to be these kinds of candles in the wind who have no control or no say whatsoever in the quote unquote conflict that is taking place around them, as though they are just bystanders dismayed by what these senseless men are doing. But in fact, women, Palestinian women in particular, have led so many revolutions and have played such a vital role. But also, the larger theme here is fragmentation. So not only are we fragmented as Palestinians by our different legal statuses, blue ID, green ID, diaspora, 48, West Bank, besieged in the Gaza Strip, but we are also fragmented on the basis of a hierarchy of suffering and who is condemned to die and who is grievable and who is, we're all condemned to die in the end of the day under an annihilatory project, but some of us are grievable and some of us are not. So we're also fragmented into journalists and medics and fighters and women and children and so on. But even within that journalist framework, there are journalists who work for local journalist initiatives who get accused of being Hamas agents and so on and so forth. And then there are journalists who work for reputable, quote unquote, sophisticated international journalism outlets. And that creates another set of division. And the refrain from using any of these frameworks in this book was to kind of counter divorcing Palestinian people from one another and really bring them into a collective.
I first learned about you when I think a lot of people, I mean, millions around the world were learning about the reality on the ground in occupied Palestine, occupied East Jerusalem in Sheikh Jarrah, which is your family's neighborhood. A lot of people have seen a clip of that viral video of the settler saying, if I don't take it, someone else will. Well, he was talking to your sister, Muna, in your backyard. I mean, you talk in the book about how your home was literally occupied by fanatical settlers who just took over a part of your home. I mean, how does it actually work?
Yeah, I mean, it's an extremely absurd situation. I think that's my favorite word to describe it, as violent and abhorrent as it is. I think it's above all absurd because in truth, what happened, without exaggeration, is that there are groups of American Jews who decided that they are going to flee whatever fraud charges or whatever other kinds of charges and come live in our homes and be paid salaries by other settler organizations that are registered as charities that are tax exempt in this country. Many of them are in New York, who then exploit an already asymmetrical judiciary that is built by settlers and for settlers, that was built on the skeletons of Palestinians, that was built for the very purpose of advancing the Zionist project. It's not just complicity from these institutions, but it's a collusion and a partnership to take over people's homes. And this is not just in our neighborhood, this is happening all over the map, anywhere you lay your finger. In our particular case, the Israelis were forging documents. The courts would refuse to look at our documents because they were from before the Israeli regime took over Jerusalem, and thus they were invalid. And it is then framed as a real estate dispute. But in fact, it is without a doubt a political project and a political assault on a Jerusalemite neighborhood meant to advance the Judaization of what remains of Jerusalem, what remains of Arab and Palestinian Jerusalem. If you go just 10 minutes from our neighborhood to Silwan, for example, you'll see that there are thousands of Palestinians who are threatened not with expulsion like us, but with demolition on the basis that their homes sit on archaeological sites. And obviously this is fabricated, and we can spend a lot of time, proving that there is no, ruins or architectural anything underneath Silwan. But even if there were some kind of biblical site, that is a fanatic set of actions to say, oh, we are going to displace this entire community because there might be something in there. And this, again, as I said, this extends all across the map. I can also talk to you about Masafir Yatta, where Palestinians are being pushed out of their homes on the basis that they are living in a military zone or a firing zone. But what the media will not tell the average American or the average Westerner is that their lands, their ancestral lands, where they have cultivated for decades, if not centuries, have been designated as firing zones by the Israeli government for the sole explicit purpose of expelling them.
How old were you when this happened to you?
I think the first time they came in 2008, I must have been 10 years old, and then the second time I must have been 11, when they officially took over half of our home.
And when you say they took over half of your home, what do you mean? Like, how did how did you live there? I mean it
in a literal sense. We have a drywall between us.
Oh my God. And you said in the book, I mean, at one point they actually burned your sister's crib. So they were actually antagonizing, threatening you, I'm assuming daily, as trying to compel you to leave.
Yes, I mean, like you said, it's the purpose. It's important to note that these are not settler families. These are not settler families that have taken over half of our home, but it's a settler organization that hires then these, frankly, mercenaries who live for a few months at a time. Sometimes they have their dogs terrorize our families. Sometimes they, when I was growing up, they would even do sexually explicit gestures. And it's, like you said, it's for the purpose of making our lives miserable, of driving us out of Jerusalem. But no one is paying us to stay in our homes, and we're happy to stay. And meanwhile, they have to get paid. But I think a question that I get often, which I think it's it's a good faith question. People ask, have you ever had interactions with them, or do you ever try to talk to them and stuff like this? And I think anyone would agree that even if the person who took your home, who stole your home, was baking you cookies every single day, you would still have a problem with theft in the first place.
Right. I mean, as you mentioned, they should be called homicidal burglars, not just settlers. It's just so gentle of a word when you really look at what they are doing, what they go over there to do, backed by charities. Here we are facing a bill that could potentially just upend actual nonprofits that are raising money for Palestine. Meanwhile, these settlers are backed by tens of millions of dollars. The IDF is getting funded by charities. It's just cartoonish, Mohammed. And I don't think that people really realize kind of that visceral nature of apartheid. I mean, what you are talking about right now, things like this video I just saw the other day of a Palestinian plot of land literally surrounded by a cage, erected by the Israeli military, surrounded by violent, fanatical settlers. The grandmother, the elderly grandmother in the home, had to get medical attention. The soldiers wouldn't let them leave. They had to break down the door of the cage. I mean, I know this is a really extreme example, but it's just absolutely astonishing. I mean, as South Africans call it, is apartheid on steroids.
Yeah, what's also astonishing is that I don't think they realize, I don't think they realize how depraved their actions are. Like, I think this is a feature that is often neglected in our critiques of Zionism, is the complete lack of self. I think they know that they're killing civilians for sure, and they target civilians, but there is not a thought given to these kinds of actions. They don't think twice about their actions. It's everything is justifiable in the Zionist mind. And the example, what's been happening in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jenin, in the south of Lebanon, has been absolutely horrific. But the one example that I have thought about every single day has been the pager attacks on south of Lebanon, because it exemplifies the moral rot of the Zionist movement. You have a group of men and women who convened in a conference room many, many, many years ago, and somebody came up with this idea: what if we blew up the genitals of Hezbollah fighters and their family members, so that they're not dead, but they're living with these debilitating disabilities for the rest of their lives? And they went through with this plan, and year after year, nobody gave it a second thought, and there were phases, and it was predetermined in advance, and then they took it out, and then it was celebrated as some kind of innovative genius, when in fact it is the most horrific, depraved action that so many people were involved in the planning. This is also the problem, I think, with so many of the liberal discourse that pins Zionist atrocities only on Netanyahu or only on the Likud party. Because, the society itself is, to a large degree, happy and content with what has been done to Gaza, and are happy and content with the kinds of horrific orchestrated attacks, like the pager attack, or the blowing up of the Ahli hospital, or we've seen Israeli doctors in hordes sign statements compelling the government to bomb hospitals in Gaza. We see these examples over and over again, and I think if we keep continuing to ignore that the root cause of all of this is Zionism, and that it must be abolished, for it is a supremacist, expansionist ideology, we are not going to get to go anywhere.
No, indeed. And it's so deeply frustrating to see this all pinned on Netanyahu and his extremist cabinet when, like you said, I mean, Zionism itself is predicated on a genocidal mindset and ideology, the expulsion of native people. On one hand, Palestinians are boxed into being these perfect victims that are polite and check all the boxes. On the other hand, like you're saying, Israelis can be completely insane. And I'm not just talking about the war criminals who parade around in women's lingerie after they pillage and murder the women. I'm talking about the spokespeople, the diplomats, the government officials, and the media. They are going out there saying the most genocidal rhetoric, having these pseudo-intellectual conversations about why it's so important and acceptable to deprive millions of people of food, water, and medical aid. And they're considered normal.
It's also, this, what you just mentioned, is so underreported most of the time. The positive view would say, oh, it's underreported because they're bombing us so much that we don't have time to focus on their rhetoric. But our rhetoric is heavily, 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 heavily scrutinized. And this is the distinction between so-called semantic violence and the absolute hyper scrutiny of it. when it comes from students, or if a student slips up or says something or says death to Israel or says something that's incendiary or inflammatory, they can lose their careers. They can, be doxxed, harassed, even jailed, and now deported. But the Israelis can say whatever they want, and no one bats an eye. So I think it's ultimately not really about what we say. It's about who's allowed to say what.
Right. I mean, I just keep thinking about Shireen Abu Akleh. Obviously, it was a big part of your book because she was, a quote unquote American citizen. I mean, she was this beloved Palestinian journalist. The perpetrators of her death were never held accountable, of course. And then I just keep thinking of her funeral being attacked, the pallbearers carrying her casket being attacked by the Israeli military. But it's not just famous people. I mean, it's all public displays of mourning. When I was in Palestine, a farmer didn't turn around quickly enough at the behest of a soldier and was killed. We went to his memorial. A couple dozen people were there. Israeli soldiers set up a makeshift checkpoint, ended up tear gassing, shooting rubber bullets at the people who just attended the memorial. This is what they do. And I think that really speaks volumes about the nature of this kind of fascist military dictatorship, where even just public displays of celebration, like, in regard to the Palestinian hostages that were released, you can't celebrate, you can't mourn. All of that is criminalized. And you're still supposed to be the perfect, polite victims, given this extraordinary level of control that you've all grown up under. I mean, given the circumstances, Palestinians have actually been very restrained, I would say.
Extremely restrained, extremely restrained, and it's grief, it's grief, it's celebration. It's the young Palestinian men gathering in Ramadan on the Damascus Gate steps and then being tear gassed and attacked with skunk water trucks. It's about attacking the Palestinian collective. It's about attacking any kind of national gathering or national expression or national sentiments. So many the numbers of the number of Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli jails right now are incomprehensible, and the numbers of them who have been imprisoned and charged over Facebook and social media posts is beyond horrific. There's an attack on not only your land and your resources and your water and your energy and gas and your home and your family and your family members, but there's an attack on the psyche. There is a war on the Palestinian psyche, and the goal of that is to break your spirit. But I think we have been lucky to be born into a people, at least, as flawed as we are, and everybody is flawed, but we have been lucky, to live with such a collective mindset that has allowed us, to get through all of this. There are a myriad of mental health issues that face everyday Palestinians on the ground and in the diaspora. But I think there is a kind of resilience that our enemies, or our cousins, as we say in Arabic, could learn from. I watch, in Arabic we say sharrul baliyati ma yudhak, which means like the worst calamity is what makes you laugh. And I think it's quite, like, I watch these Jewish American students on college campuses cry and plead for their lives and hyperventilate, and I find it hilarious, to be honest, because it's fictitious, and it's rooted in a certain spinelessness. You have, you are in the Ivy League. First of all, you're in the Ivy League. You have a certain level of protection from the state that we can never dream of. You also have the ethno-national homeland. You have the nuclear arsenal at your behest. You have the support of the major world powers. And yet you are terrified to your core when you hear somebody chant from the river to the sea. I think there needs to be better folktales told to these young students, because they grow up without any resilience. I mean, this is, of course, it's insufferable and it's hard to deal with for Palestinian students who face actual scrutiny and face actual disciplinary action and get deported and so on and so forth. But I think it's in the long term, it's sad to have a people who have survived such an insane tragedy in history, like, such a crazy, remarkable, atrocious crime against humanity, which is the Holocaust, who continue to live in fear today, even though they have all the power. They have absolutely all the power when it comes, at least, to the Palestinian Israeli conflict, or as it is referred to.
I mean, I want to read a quote from your book. You say to be Palestinian today is to feel like you're caught in a fever dream, trapped in someone else's hallucination, to be interrogated about the hidden insidiousness about our chants while Israeli politicians boast about ethnically cleansing Gaza across the media. I mean, Palestinians' existence is basically being browbeaten into condemning something that isn't happening and to sanitize your rage about a genocide that is actually happening. Black is white, up is down. Words are terrorism, but drone bombings are not.
It's an upside down world. I say somewhere in that thing, I say you feel like you're trapped in someone else's hallucination. And this is why I think it's so dangerous to get caught in these things, to get caught in these discursive traps, or to fall into these rhetorical loops that are extremely distracting. This is why, be you a student or an academic or somebody at a bookstore, at a hospital, or whatever, and you get falsely accused of anti-Semitism while the so-called self-proclaimed Jewish state, literally burns people alive in the refugee tents. I don't think it's wise to engage in any of these kinds of discursive traps, because they are fundamentally red herrings. They're meant to take away from the focal point, which is genocide. Now, I'm not saying that maybe there are some students whose fear is legitimate, that it's bodily and visceral and real, but it's also not my problem. We literally have tens of thousands of people under the rubble that we have to worry about burying. We have no time for such ridiculous conversations, assuaging the paranoias of our oppressors.
Indeed. I mean, one of my favorite chapters of the book is called Drones and Tropes. I mean, you talk about this compulsory need for Palestinians to apologize for anti-Semitism or to denounce anti-Semitism while discussing the crimes actively being committed against them right now. But Palestinians are not responsible for centuries-old anti-Semitic tropes. As you plainly say, it's not my fault they're Jewish.
Yeah, it's also one of my favorite chapters, and I don't think that chapter in the book is particularly original, but I think it was so, when it was part of it was published as an article in Mondoweiss, and it was so incredibly well received. And I don't think it was because it's original, but because it said what everybody else was thinking and was almost terrorized into silence, into not saying. But this is an insane world. This is an insane society if we accept that bombs, drones, siege, occupation is all business as usual, but let somebody say, quote unquote, the wrong thing, and all hell breaks loose. Yeah, I think it's time that we set the terms of engagement.
Well, first of all, I mean, the fact that we can't talk about how powerful AIPAC is, right? I mean, that's a trope. You can't talk about AIPAC's undue influence, the fact that they spend more money than any other single issue lobby on the Hill. That's a trope. You can't talk about the fact that IOF officials or intelligence officials from Israel have infiltrated certain mainstream media institutions. That's a trope. So it's just the refusal to speak basic facts about our reality because you don't want to feed into tropes. And it's really doing a disservice to acknowledging what is right in front of our faces, Mohammed. But you talk about something really important. You talk about how kind of you grew up and, obviously Sheikh Jarrah was kind of like this zoo, especially when, diplomats and media representatives and all these people are coming to observe. And it's all this kind of passive observation and reporting. Which brings me to another really crucial expose in your book about the politics and policy of defanging, stripping away our revolutionary agency. And it's just something that I've been thinking about so much, is that colonizers have set the terms and boundaries of acceptable thought and dialogue. You can't say from the river to the sea. You can't say free Palestine. All of these things are just out of bounds, from the people who basically have dictated the rules. And what it really boils down to is, you want to strip Palestinians of their revolutionary agency. You want to put them in perpetual victimhood, so that we can never really talk about what decolonization looks like, because then you really make liberals feel uncomfortable.
It has a lot to do with the substance of these arguments, of course, but I think this has to do a lot more with the affect and the kind of like even the body language of certain Zionists, the performance of certain Zionists when they are facing or confronting these quote unquote tropes. I think even the New York Times at some point in 2021 or 2022 put up a spread of all the children who had been killed in the 2021 Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip, and people were accusing them of blood libel, even though they did kill all these kids. And we see this today with the Gaza Strip. There's a disproportionate targeting of children by snipers. And if you mention that, you're accused of blood libel, and most people do not want to be accused of that, but most people don't realize that the Zionists have created this culture in which such factual statements become incendiary and disagreeable and offensive and bigoted and so on and so forth. And it's not so much about the arguments, because their arguments are not sound, and I would even say they are not valid, but it's about how they deliver their arguments. It's such a coordinated attack. They are appalled by the accusations, even though they're true. They're appalled, they're offended, they're victimized by the accusations, they're made uncomfortable, and so they create this culture of fear in which these things feel like taboos. And I think the appropriate response to false accusations of anti-Semitism, to these kinds of discursive, endless loops, is ridicule, is rejection, is refusal, is to say, no, you're fucking nuts. Get out of my, that is the only appropriate response, because then it inspires in other people the tendency to shatter these taboos, to say, oh, I too feel that this is an upside down world, but I feel censored within my language. But I'm seeing this person so bluntly rejected and call it out for what it is. It empowers people. It then creates a counterculture, and then maybe the dominant culture, in which false accusations of anti-Semitism are simply not tolerated, in which you do not elevate anything over systemic, government-backed, policy-driven violence, material, real, tangible violence. That is the issue, I think, that we are facing today, is that we get caught into these discussions when sometimes you just need to tell the person, frankly, to eat shit.
Anything else to say about just that kind of defanging of the revolutionary mindset? Because it does seem like, when we're looking at the West Bank, I mean, all of it's a perfect example of just people say, oh, well, they had a knife, right? But it's like, okay, well, even if that was true, I mean, it's an illegal occupation. So what exactly do you think is going on? How are people supposed to resist, other than what they're doing in places like Jenin? I mean, this is an illegal military occupation, and these people have the right to armed resistance.
Yeah, and I think the average person, anybody with common sense, would understand that defending yourself against intruders, against colonizers, against thieves, against burglars, against murderous regimes is a fundamental right. You're entitled to defend yourself and your family. And actually, across history, people who have done so have been hailed as heroes. But violence itself is, essentially a mutating concept. It's something to celebrate when it's sanctioned by the empire, and it's something to pro-clutch at when it's done by natives, by these young men in tracksuits. But again, this is not it's not like a fundamental Western opposition to violence or militias or whatever. It's a rejection of any kind of political prospect for the Palestinian. Because anytime the Palestinian has engaged in armed resistance or has engaged in kinds of resistance that have extended beyond the bounds of what is acceptable to a liberal society, that is, that is the time, those are some of the only times we have been heard. So what does that say about the world, and what does that say to the Palestinian when we are told time and time again the only time people are going to listen to us and talk about us and put us in their headlines is when we engage in violent resistance? But ultimately, this is about the rejection of Palestinian armed resistance, is about a rejection of a Palestinian national project, is about a rejection of actually ending the occupation. Everybody can sing every day about ending the occupation, but when it becomes real, we are terrified of it. We lose our compass. We refuse to even entertain it. For years, maybe all of my life, I've been hearing about a two-state solution while Israeli bulldozers eat away at our land in areas that are supposedly under Palestinian Authority control. It's like a circus where they're just telling us these narratives to buy time while they're creating facts on the ground, while they're setting really the terms of engagement and creating the roadmap for the future, while robbing us of any kind of future, and while sanctioning even our ambitions, even our intentions, even our hopes and dreams. You know what I mean? There's also when we say defanging of Palestinians, it's not just taking our rifles and vilifying our freedom fighters, but there's also interrogation of our thoughts. They ask us, do you condemn this, and do you condemn that, and do you want to do this, and do you want to throw Israelis into the sea, and what's your issue with those people? And it's never about actually engaging with you in a certain political uplifted discourse, but it's about making sure you concede to the liberal world order before you are even allowed entry to the conversation. And that needs to be rejected.
Totally. I mean, these people need to ask themselves what would happen. It's not like these people are passively dying. They're being slaughtered, intentionally. And if your whole family was murdered, how would you feel about the murderers? I mean, it's just so outlandish to be interrogated about, disavowing your allegiance or connection to people who are literally putting themselves on the line to prevent more Palestinians from being put in mass graves. So it's just an abomination, honestly, in every sense, Mohammed, to see this unfold over the last 15 months and just the inverted reality that we're being dictated. I want to read another quote that I thought was really powerful. In situating the Holocaust outside of history and placing it not just in the past, but in an eternal future, Zionism today has created a status quo in which the possibility of a second Holocaust is given primacy over a Holocaust happening in the present. Now, this is another bizarre kind of thing that's dictated to us, that we can't have any comparisons to what Israel is doing to Nazi Germany. It's another policing of thought and language when you just even invoke a comparison, even though we're talking about a large concentration camp where people are being picked off as if it were target practice. So I want you to kind of expand on what you meant by that quote.
The quote itself is it's about this frustrating debate in the West. The debate in the West is not about burning flesh and massacre. There are people of conscience whose compass is pointing at the right direction, who remain compelled only by materialist analysis. But most people in the West, the debate isn't about people being burned alive in their tents or people being forcibly displaced. The debate is about, what does Zionism mean? And it's about, does from the river to the sea means you want to throw Jews into the sea, and blah, blah, blah. And there is an elevation of the hypothetical, of something in the future, of something that could potentially happen sometime, over what is happening in real time. So we're kind of reducing the active genocide, the active Holocaust taking place in the Gaza Strip, to a marginal issue, because we first must address the intentions and the wants and the dreams that linger inside the Palestinian, and then we can talk about the thing. But that reinforces such a crazy power dynamics in which Israelis and Zionists are infallible, they are untouchable. You're unable to criticize them, you're unable to hold them to account. It's as though they have invented genocide, and genocide can only be committed against them. The exceptionalization of the Holocaust is absurd because it is disingenuous. It is used to advance another genocidal political project. And on the matter of not comparing Israelis to Nazis, and the fact that that's even a bullet point in the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, I think if they don't want to be compared to Nazis, they should not act like Nazis, But also, when we would protest against the Palestinian Authority, we would liken them to the Zionists, because they are cooperating with the Zionists. They are using the same tear gas that is made in the same factories. So when the Israelis are using the Nazi playbook in terms of their propaganda, in terms of their book burning, in terms of their burning people alive, in terms of carving stars of David on people's cheeks, in terms of branding freed political prisoners with numbers. If they don't want to be compared to Nazis, they should stop acting like Nazis. If they don't want to be called killers of children, they should stop killing children. That is the end.
Yeah, exactly. Stop doing it. At the end of the book, Mohammed, you provide some hope for this moment. This moment is profound. There's a lot of gravity behind it, and I would argue it's an existential moment when you compound, not only the genocide that's unfolding, but the environmental crises that we're facing. I mean, all of this is really interlocked. Can you share some of that insight with us now of what brings you hope in this moment?
It's hard to say. I think it's hard to say what brings me hope. But I think in tweaking one's definition of hope from a feeling to a discipline and to a practice, it becomes a lot easier. I truly do believe in hope as an obligation, and optimism as an obligation, because otherwise, if we don't believe we are going to be liberated, we are not going to be liberated. And another thing that I don't want to sideline, or another, I think, elephant in the room, is that, I face a lot of scrutiny here. There's a lot of campaigns to, I get shit, you know what I mean? But even with all of that, I am incredibly privileged. I could protest in front of the Israeli embassy and not get shot. I have a roof over my head. And so when you're watching people who have nothing in the Gaza Strip teach master classes in dignity and in refusal and in hope and in continuing, you feel ashamed of your own hopelessness and of your own, cynical worldview. Of course, the global powers are stacked against us, but nothing remains as is, and the world changes, and you just have to believe in it, because it's your obligation to be hopeful.